Hi class, in this recording we're going to focus on pregnancy and childbirth. So let's dive into it. As we look at pregnancy, pregnancy is also known as gestation technically. And as we measure pregnancy, most people say 9 months. In terms of an average, it's 266 days from the point of conception until the point of birth. And pregnancy or gestation typically is going to be measured from the woman's last menstrual period because that's a clearly, it's just an easy data point to get at because it's very objective. And as opposed to when did I ovulate, many women don't know the precise moment they ovulated, and if they do know that, they certainly wouldn't know the precise moment that conception occurred. So as we look at birthing, we assume 280 days or 40 weeks from the last known menstrual period. And this is going to be the full term, the duration of pregnancy. And we can take this term, this duration of pregnancy, and break it up into trimesters. Each trimester is going to be 3 months long. We have three 3-month periods or 3 12-week periods for someone to be full term. As we look at this process, the language has been changing a lot, so it's been kind of hard for me to stay on top of the language. What was really confusing for me is after teaching a couple units of pregnancy, or a couple semesters of A&P, my wife conceived, and I remember going to the doctor's office, and I was all proud of myself. I was going to use technically correct terminology, and everyone just said, "Oh, baby. Oh, baby." And they just kept saying, "Oh, baby, baby this, baby that." And I was like, but why don't you say embryo or fetus or conceptus? So know that a lot of times in a clinical setting, these technical terms aren't always going to be used, particularly nursing. And I know most of my students are pre-nursing students, but it is good to know what these technical terms mean. So as we look at the conceptus is going to be everything, the whole mess of stuff that's made, notably the placenta and associated membranes, in addition to the fetus. In terms of what is implanted, many people say a fertilized egg or a zygote that is implanted, and that's not actually true. It's the blastocyst that implants. And this is the developing hollow ball that forms typically during the first 2 weeks. Then we're going to have an embryo, and an embryo is from day 16 after fertilization through week 8 after fertilization. After 8 weeks, the embryo is now recategorized as a fetus, and it's going to be a fetus until it is born. After birth, the baby is called a neonate, or neonate. Neo meaning new. And that's going to be a newborn child that is from the date of birth to 6 weeks of age. And these calendars, or these dates and these distinctions, get to be kind of hairy, particularly for prematurely born children. And those prematurely born children are going to kind of have 2 calendars. They're going to still have that calendar from conception and the calendar from birth as well. And I have several good friends who have prematurely born children, and it gets to be a little dicey at times. Then when we look at the fetus is going to be attached to the placenta via a tube known as the umbilical cord. And the umbilical cord is going to serve as a passageway or a way for blood to flow away from and to the placenta, and vice versa with the child, or in this case, the fetus. And then that placenta is going to be used for nutrient exchange. We're going to have the child's blood will pick up needed nutrients from mom's bloodstream and deliver excess waste products into mom's bloodstream. The placenta is also going to release hormones, and those hormones help to regulate the pregnancy process and have mom's mammary glands develop. The hormones from the placenta also aid the growing child in development as well. Now, as we look at the hormones involved with pregnancy, we have estrogens and progesterones, and we've talked about those in a fair amount of detail. Both estrogen and progesterone help to maintain the lining of the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus, I should say, the endometrium. Two hormones we haven't talked about in a lot of detail are HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and HCSM, human chorionic somatomamotropin. And these are four hormones that are all going to be released by the placenta. And over the course of the pregnancy, we find that human chorionic gonadotropin spikes at about week 2. And after week 2, human chorionic gonadotropin levels off and then declines throughout the pregnancy, while there's a dramatic increase in estrogen throughout the pregnancy and a dramatic increase in progesterone throughout the pregnancy. Very early on, the corpus luteum is going to be the most important source of these hormones. The placenta hasn't formed. Immediately after fertilization and implantation, there is no placenta. However, there is a corpus luteum on the ovary, and that corpus luteum on the ovary is capable of secreting estrogen and progesterone. To keep that corpus luteum going, we have the HCG that is going to prolong its life cycle. And then towards the second half of the pregnancy, from week 7 to 17, that corpus luteum will degenerate and the placenta takes over the endocrine functions of pregnancies, which takes over the production of the estrogen and the progesterone. HCG is important because it is going to be secreted by both the blastocyst and placenta to keep the corpus luteum growing. This HCG is what we use also to measure for pregnancies. We can detect it 8 to 9 days after conception, and it's just a standard ELISA test, so we can do our standard pregnancy test to determine whether or not an individual was pregnant. There was a really interesting case study or laboratory activity done by a colleague of mine when she was doing her graduate endocrinology work, and it was a fun activity. They just took a bunch of pregnancy tests from the stores, and they had the super expensive $15 per test, and then they had the cheapo depot dollar store test as well, and they found that the dollar store test was the most reliable out of all of the pregnancy tests that they tested. And I always thought that was kind of cool. And this might be TMI, but my wife prefers the cheapo ones. They tend to be more reliable, and $1 versus $15 a test, that makes a difference. I went a little too far there. I skipped too soon. So as we look at that human chorionic gonadotropin, the HCG, by stimulating the growth of the corpus luteum, it's going to cause the corpus luteum to continue to secrete progesterone and estrogen. And we need that progesterone and estrogen to maintain the endometrium of the uterus so that a menstrual cycle or a mensing event doesn't cause the implanted blastocyst to slough off. As we look at the estrogens and the effects of these estrogens, we find that over the course of the pregnancy, estrogens are 30 times higher than normal. So as we look at an ovulation event, those graphs I talked about made it seem like there's a huge spike in estrogen during an ovulation event. And well, relatively speaking, there was a spike in estrogen. As we go throughout a pregnancy, we find that the estrogen concentrations skyrocket relative to a regular monthly cycle. And we also find the progesterone concentrations skyrocket as well. And this is going to cause the mother's uterus and external genitalia to enlarge. So there's an enlarging of the breast, there's an enlarging of the vulva, the labia minora, labia majora. The mammary ducts within the mammary glands are going to increase in size, and breasts, generally speaking, are going to nearly double in size over the course of pregnancy. There's another hormone known as relaxin, and relaxin is a hormone that causes lots of the connective tissues to become loose. In particular, it relaxes the pubic symphysis and causes the pelvis to become wider, and that's a good thing because we are going to have a child's head moving through the birth canal. As we look at progesterone in particular comes from both the placenta and corpus luteum, and it's a strong inhibitor of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. In other words, during pregnancy, Additional follicles are not going to be ovulating oocytes, and that's a good thing. Progesterone, notably, will suppress uterine contractions. So if somebody is going into early labor, you can give that individual progesterone, and that's going to cause her to not have those uterine contractions be upregulated. So by having elevated progesterone, this progesterone is going to prevent premature childbirth and menstruation. Notice right at the end of pregnancy, progesterone concentrations decline. They drop off right at the end. And that's a good thing because right at the end, we don't want to inhibit uterine contractions anymore. We want the kid to come out of the uterus. Progesterone is also going to stimulate the development of acini within the mammary glands, mammary acini, so that we can have more milk production within the female's breast. And progesterone also is going to make it so that we have more decidual cells within the endometrium. And those decidual cells are a food source for the growing blastocyst. Now, as we think of human chorionic somatomamotropin, that's a tongue twister, somatomamotropin. It's abbreviated as HCS in your text, sometimes also abbreviated as HCSM. This is a hormone that is going to be released by the placenta. It begins secretion from the placenta around week 5. And this is going to steadily be upregulated and increase in concentration until birth, until pregnancy has gone full term. And we find that there's high concentrations of this hormone, but we really don't know what it does. It seems like it's kind of similar to growth hormone, but it's just a weaker variation of growth hormone. It also seems to make mom less sensitive to insulin. And if mom is less sensitive to insulin, she's going to have elevated blood sugar levels. And that elevated blood sugar levels in mom is typically going to mean that the child can get more blood sugar, more glucose through the placental barrier. So that leaves more glucose for the developing fetus. Now, as the woman is going through a pregnancy, her pituitary gland is going to respond to these hormonal changes. And because our pituitary gland is the master gland and makes so many different hormones, our pituitary gland as a human race will increase about 50% in pregnant women over the course of the pregnancy, because the pituitary gland is going to need to make more thyrotropin to promote the development of the thyroid gland, and more prolactin to promote the development of milk, and then more adrenocorticotropic hormone to help regulate fluid balance in her body, particularly saline balance in her body. That thyroid gland in the woman's body, in the pregnant woman, is going to become 50% larger under the influence of human chorionic gonadotropin, the pituitary thyrotropin, and human chorionic thyrotropin from the placenta. In essence, the woman's basal metabolic rate skyrockets. As she has more thyroid gland tissue, she's going to have more thyroid hormone, and more thyroid hormone causes her metabolic rate to increase for both mom and the child. And that's one of the reasons why women are so hungry when they're pregnant, because of this dramatic increase in metabolic rate. We also find that the parathyroid glands are going to enlarge and increase osteoclast activity. Clasts means to break down. What are being broken down? Osteo meaning bone. So bone destroying cells. And this is a good thing because we need to liberate calcium and phosphorus for the fetal skeletal development. It also can be a bad thing, particularly if the mom had heavy metal poisoning when she was younger. Those heavy metals could be sequestered in the extracellular matrix of her skeleton, of her dense bone tissue. And when there's this upregulation of osteoclast activity, all of those heavy metal ions that were sequestered in the dense bone tissue of her skeleton can be released into her bloodstream a second time. And there have been instances of children in utero being poisoned, receiving lead poisoning from their mom because their mother had lead poisoning when mom was a young child. So mom was exposed to lead as a young child. Mom grew up and the lead went away. Well, sort of. The lead got sequestered into mom's bones, and then during pregnancy, that lead was released into the bloodstream a second time. As we look at ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, it's going to stimulate the adrenal glands to make glucocorticoids. And as we have more glucocorticoids, typically a stress hormone, being dumped into mom's system, that's going to cause mom to take some of her proteins and digest them down, to have protein catabolism and release amino acids into the bloodstream. And those amino acids can then be uptook by the fetus for protein synthesis within the fetus. Aldosterone is important for pregnancy for mom because it's going to allow mom to retain more fluid and increase mom's overall blood volume. And then finally, we have that relaxin. Relaxin is a hormone secreted by both the corpus luteum and the placenta, and it's going to cause progesterone to be more effective on the decidual cells. So we find that relaxin and progesterone, it has a synergistic effect on the development of these decidual cells within the endometrium. So we have lots of nutrients for the growing child. We also find that relaxin promotes blood vessel growth within the uterus, and that's good because that growing uterus is going to need a lot of nutrient supply. And then finally, relaxin looses connective tissues. Think of dense regular and dense irregular connective tissues. Notably, the pelvic girdle and the pubic symphysis are loosened by relaxin. Late in pregnancy, many women complain about sacroiliac joint pain. And the reason they are experiencing sacroiliac or SI joint pain is because of elevated relaxin concentrations, causing the sacrum to shift relative to the two coxal bones. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board. And as always, happy studies.